Well, good morning, folks. I have a confession, and the confession is I do not have a song for us this morning. I tried hard to find a song for Daniel 9, and all I could come up with was Elton John, and that seemed like not quite the right match thematically for... Looks like Daniel must be the... You get that. Anyway, so we're going to knock things off to get things started there. This is our... Yes, you had the right one. Just take it. This is the fourth in our increasingly inaccurately named 3-week diversion into Daniel. We will finish Daniel one way or the other this week. If I have to just wave my hands and say, Daniel, how about that, huh? We will be finishing with it this week and moving onward. We had left off last time around in Daniel 9. You remember we were looking at this prophecy of the 70 weeks of years. And there were a lot of numbers going by, and we decided we were going to just kind of pause it there and come back for it. Well, today is the coming back for it. So with that in mind, let's recap back to where we had left off. You remember we started by looking at the sweep of history that Daniel, in many ways, is predicting, that Daniel, most of Daniel at least, seems to be covering, right? That in the years after the life of Daniel, or late in his life, we have this succession of empires. We begin with the Babylonian Empire, that in 605, the Babylonians carry off Daniel and many of the other young men of Judah and resettle him there. Daniel, as he goes, is mindful of this prophecy of Jeremiah. You remember that Jeremiah predicts that 70 years later, the people of Israel will return, that they will be sent into exile for themselves and their children and their grandchildren, but that this will not last forever, that God will be faithful and he will bring them back to the land once again. We know that in 535, 70 years later, that prophecy is fulfilled, and the decree goes out from the Persians for the people to be resettled back there to begin the process of rebuilding Jerusalem, events that we find detailed in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Okay, so there's Babylon. Babylon falls during this period, right? So prior to 535, Babylon falls. You remember the whole thing with Belteshazzar and the writing on the wall, right? And there's the judgment enacted against them, and the Persian Empire comes in. They overthrow Babylon, and they set themselves up in their place. The Persians, in their turn, fall to Alexander the Great. Alexander, coming out of Greece, coming out of Macedonia, overruns all the Persian Empire and establishes his own kingdom in its place. In just 10 years, he conquers all of the known world, and then at the height of his power, Alexander dies, and his empire divides, right? His empire splits between all his successors. In particular, it splits into 4 separate kingdoms, and the one we're most interested in is the kingdom of the Seleucids, that the Seleucid Empire rises up in the east, takes control of Israel, right? They become the dominant power in the Middle East today. One of the kings of the Seleucids is this guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. He's a very bad dude. He no longer puts up with the Jews any longer, right? He doesn't tolerate their worship, their religious style. He declares an end to that, sets up his own idols in the temple, sacrifices a pig on the temple in the holy place, right? Defiles the temple every way that he can. And at the end of this process, the Jews rise up against him. There's this event in the series of the books of Maccabees that the Jews rise up. They overthrow the Seleucids. They kick him out. And they get 1 century of freedom again before Rome comes on the scene as our last big empire. And then, of course, Rome will rule Israel and the surrounding nations for years to come after the life of Christ. Right? Already caught back up on our history. So our key figure that we've referenced here during this period is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus, the manifest God, right? This guy who will have no more truck with the Jewish religion, starts the war, right? Replaces the high priest with his own guy, massacres a bunch of the Jews. The Jews have enough of this. They start a war. Their war is successful. We today celebrate Hanukkah, or at least maybe we don't celebrate Hanukkah, but we remember Hanukkah as the celebration of the victory of the Jews over Antiochus and his forces. So far, so good? Okay. So we've been working our way through the 5 major prophetic sections of Daniel. His prophecy of the statue with the head of gold and the chest of silver and so on down. Of the 4 beasts, right? You remember there was the 4-headed leopard, and there was the bear that was raised up on one side, and the lion that had 2 wings on it that were taken away. The prophecy of the ram and the goat. And then where we are right now is Daniel 9, the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And then we have one final one we'll try to get to today, Daniel 11 and 12, give us the prophecies of the kings and of the end. Now, as we've been going forward, we have seen how clearly most of these prophecies map to historic empires, right? There is this vision Daniel has of, for instance, of the belly of bronze, or elsewhere it's described as a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads, or as a goat with 1 horn that falls off and then 4 horns grow in its place. And again, this is identified to us as the kingdom of Greece, this kingdom that moves very quickly, right, that divides into 4 pieces. We see all these things that very clearly match that to the empire of Alexander, right? We said one of the nice things about Daniel is that Daniel's got these angelic interpreters, and he tends to turn to them and say, I don't know what to make of any of this. And the angel says, well, that's easy. This one's the king of Greece. And that makes life simple for us, right? It's kind of nice having all this identification made. It's not until we get late in the game that things start to become confusing, because Daniel has these visions of this final terrible beast. He has 2 different visions in which he sees a little horn growing out of an animal, and the little horn is wise and evil, and it oppresses the people of God, right? And we said that at that point there start to be some questions and some unclarities as to, is this always the same guy that's in view? Is this Antiochus that we're talking about? Is this Nero or some other figure that we're talking about, maybe coming out of Rome? It's not entirely certain what figure is in view here, or are there multiple figures? Is it multiple fulfillments of the same prophecy? We kind of covered through all that last time. I'm not going to go through it again, but just to say, that's the picture that we had when we left off, is that up through about Alexander, everything's very, very clear. After that point, it gets a little bit harder to match the pieces of this thing together. Perhaps that's because there's still a future fulfillment waiting for them. Perhaps it's just a complicated issue, right? Anybody have any questions, anything from anything we've done in the past before we go on into new things today? All right, very good. Well then, let's return to where we'd left off last time. We're in Daniel chapter 9, and as I said, when Daniel leaves Israel, when he is carried off from Judah into captivity in Babylon, one of the things he's mindful of is that Jeremiah has made this prophecy. God has said to Jeremiah, you will be in Babylon for 70 years, right? You remember that God says this to them. He says, listen, don't start planning to come back. Don't act like you're going to be back in Judah next week. Buy houses there, buy vineyards, right? Settle down, provide for your children. Your children are going to live their whole lives in Babylon, but eventually, after 70 years, I will bring you back. And so Daniel has been keeping count here, and he notices that he is coming up on the end of 70 years that he's been in captivity. And so he prays in chapter 9 and says, God, you've promised to bring us back to the land again. Please fulfill your promise, right? Forgive us for the sins that we committed when we were in the land, the sins we continue to commit today. Please honor your promise and bring us back to the land again. And this messenger, Gabriel, right, this angelic figure comes to him, and Gabriel says, God has heard your promise, you will be restored to the land, and also I have a new prophetic word for you. And it's that word we turn to now. So this is the angel speaking to him here. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Now I'm going to just pause there for a second. If you read just that description in verse 24 and said, when will it be true that all the things in that verse are satisfied, right? Run through the list. finish transgression, put an end to sin, atone for iniquity, bring in everlasting righteousness, seal vision and prophecy, and anoint a most holy place. What are some points we might point to and say, here's when we would expect those things to be satisfied?
The end of time.
Okay, a very natural answer here is to say, that sounds like end of the world kind of language, right? I mean, an end to sin, right? A full to finish the transgression, right? That sounds like an end of the world kind of language. Good. Can you think of any other possibilities here? Okay, good. Could be pointing to the resurrection of Christ, right? Perhaps not sin ended in an absolute sense that no one is sinning anymore, but an end to the power of sin, right? That Christ now has overthrown the kingdom of the world. Christ has established a new order here. But it sounds like it's some kind of epochal change here, right? This is not just going to be some Tuesday where everybody's like, well, I guess that's it. I guess this is the end, right? Some significant event. And I think the resurrection and the end of the world are the most plausible answers to that question. All right, good. Did I see another hand?
I was going to say the similar thing that Keith said. When you look at the article, a most holy place, like NASB and some other ones have the most holy place, does that make a difference in the sense of like a most holy place could be like, you know, God calls the church to be a peculiar people, so it's kind of spread out. But if it's the, does that point to?
Okay, good. So there's one of the, so I'm not enough of a language scholar, by which I mean I'm not any kind of language scholar, to be able to unpack what the difficulties in this passage are. But reading people who are language scholars here, there are a bunch of points in this particular passage where you have to kind of squint and hold your mouth right to come up with a translation on it, right? Where there is a lot of inference into exactly what Daniel is saying here and exactly how we ought to interpret it today. And so clearly A versus the is one of the places where there's a little bit of inference. We talked last week about another one, the ESV, which is what I've been working through here, right? The ESV says something happens after 7 weeks and then something else 62 weeks later. The NASB says something will happen after 7 and 62 weeks. And so that's a very different picture, whether something happens at 7 and something else happens at 62, or whether the whole shebang happens at 69, right? And so again, there's these translational difficulties, and good faith translators are going to come to different answers about that. I think we can say there is some ambiguity for us today as to exactly how to read this. That's why I say both of these seem like plausible answers just going off this first verse here. Something significant, though, is being described here. Yeah? 70 weeks are appointed for this. 70 weeks are decreed. Know, therefore, and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moats, but for a troubled time. Now again, Dennis, before you call this one out, this is one I was talking about a moment ago. You've got the NASB, I think.
On this, yeah.
On that one, yeah. So NASB says, after 7 and 62 weeks, there shall be a prince, and the city shall be built again. It combines the two into one time period. The ESV sees it as two different ones, right? So again, a lot of complexities in the language here. I can't tell you which way is the right way to read it, right? Just be aware that there is some ambiguity in the language. After the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. So this is going to be our first passage for today. What can we say of Daniel chapter 9? First, let's try to just get a picture around some of what's being described here. Daniel's prophecy breaks this period of 70 weeks. We usually read that as 70 weeks of years. Maybe that's literal years, maybe it's not. Let's come back for that thought. But there's this prophecy of 70 weeks that is broken into 3 parts. A 7-week part, a 62-week part, and a 1 week part. And different things are described for each of these. For the first 69 weeks, we have this prophecy that Jerusalem will be rebuilt and will exist in times of trouble. Somewhere in there, an anointed one comes, either at the 7-week mark, right, depending how we read that part, or at the end of the 69 weeks. Either way, we are told at the end of 69 weeks, an anointed one will be cut off and the city and the sanctuary will be destroyed. Then we are told that there will be this last week of a covenant being confirmed with many. And in the middle of the week, or for half of the week, we are told that the sacrifices and offerings shall be put an end to, right? And so there's this split. I mean, I've got it in the halfway point here. It could be like from the 1/4 mark to the 3/4 mark. We're not explicitly told on this, right? We're just told for half of the period, sacrifice and offering will be ended. Notice, by the way, we're not told which half. Is it the first half? Is it the last half? Is it, again, somewhere in the middle? But for ease of picturing, let's just put a split line in the middle of that last week there. Is everybody good? So these are the events we want to watch for in any interpretation of this. We've got to watch for the rebuilding of the city, its existence in troubled times, an anointed one coming somewhere, an anointed one being cut off, and then this final covenant for 1 week. So far, so good? Now, there are some questions that any interpretation of this passage must attempt to answer. First, are those 70 weeks literal periods of time? Now, I don't mean are they literally 70 weeks, right? But are they 70 7-year periods? It would not be uncommon in the Old Testament to talk about a 7-year period as a week of years, right? That's language that appears elsewhere. Remember, there's this idea that every 7 years they're supposed to let the land rest, right? There's a Sabbath year, just like there's a Sabbath day, yeah? And so it'd be very natural in a Jewish context to translate a week as this 7-year period of years as easily as a literal week here, right? And so we've got this period. Is this actually 490 years, or is this just language that means a while, right? Some period of time. Is it just emphasizing the sevens and the idea of completeness there? Now, we've talked already about one of the biggest reasons to think that this might be a literal period of time. What's one of the biggest reasons, I think, to say this is maybe a literal period, actually 490 years? Okay, good. One of the biggest reasons is, no matter how you slice it, somewhere between 450 and 550 years after this, all the events of the life of Christ take place, right? And so if that is a coincidence, it is a striking coincidence. Now, you remember we talked last week, there's some mess around this. We don't know the exact date that Daniel's prophecy kicks off. There's 3 or 4 plausible years that could be the start of this countdown. We don't know the exact time that it ends. Different people have pointed to Christ's birth, his death, his triumphal entry, right? We're not sure the year of Christ's death. Is it in 30? Is it in 33? We're not sure of the exact timing on some of these events, right? So we don't know the exact start date. We don't know the exact end date. And because Jewish years are not exactly 365.25 days, we don't know exactly how long a year is either. So there's some fuzziness, but we can say that just about any start date you pick, and just about any end date you pick in that range, and just about any way you count years in that range, it's going to be somewhere between about 450 and 550 years. And you note that 490 is right about in the center of that range. If that is a coincidence, it is a striking and remarkable coincidence. Our ability to look back and see history here and count out 490 and be like, yep, that's right about the life of Christ, is a strong argument for literal fulfillment here, I think. Good. That's a good reason. Is there any other reason to suspect literal fulfillment here? I think one of the big ones, Allison, yeah?
Because of the Jeremiah prophecy.
Good. This is given in response to Daniel waiting for Jeremiah's prophecy to be fulfilled, right? Daniel reads Jeremiah, he sees Jeremiah say 70 years, and Daniel doesn't say, well, 70, that 7 is probably just there to indicate completeness and an indefinite period of time. Daniel reads that and he says, God, you said 70 years, tick-tock, right? Like, are we going home? Is this the end of the 70 years? And in response to that, he gets this other prophecy of years. That, I think, suggests a literal fulfillment as well. Now, are there reasons to think a non-literal fulfillment? Well, again, there is an echoing sevens language here. Sometimes that seems to be more indicative of, of God's perfection in the timing of this than in a particular time period. There is difficulty in getting the years to line up exactly, right? Depending how we count things, there can be challenge in getting them to line up exactly. And so if we can get close but not precise, what do we do with that, right? Do we say, oh, well, it is, it's similar periods or it's evocative periods, but maybe it's not meant to be read bang on 490 years. Does that make sense? Okay, so there's the first question we have to answer. Are the 70 weeks literal? Second, there are several people identified in this passage. We have the coming of an anointed one, a prince. A verse later we have, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. And then a verse after that, we have the people of the prince who is to come. So we have an anointed one, a prince, an anointed one, and the prince who is to come. Our second question is, are all three of those the same person? Or are those two people? They could be three people, right? The Jewish interpretation here is that this anointed one is not the same as that anointed one. These are two different guys. There are Christian interpretations that make these the same guy and that somebody else, right? There are other interpretations that say, no, this one's a prince and anointed one, that one's an anointed one, that one's a prince. That sounds like all the same dude all the way through, right? But any interpretation has got to answer, who are the anointed one or ones? Who is the prince? So what is an anointed one? Well, that phrase, anointed one, in Hebrew is the phrase Mashiach, from which we get our word Messiah, right? Or in Greek, it's Christos, right? Jesus Christ is not, Mary and Joseph's last name is not Christ, right? Jesus Christos is Jesus, the anointed one, yeah? And so we see this phrase, the anointed one, recur repeatedly in the Old Testament, and that leads to the Jewish expectation of the singular anointed one, right? The Messiah as the fulfillment of that, right? One of the clearest passages here, I think, is out of Psalm 2. David writing, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed." As a singular figure here. He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, on my holy hill." Now, in Acts chapter 4, Peter and John, as they're being called before the Sanhedrin, right? And the Sanhedrin are questioning them and demanding to know by what right they're teaching about this Jesus. This is the verse that they point back to. They quote this passage in defense of their continuing to speak regardless of who tells them to be silent, right? And so they unambiguously point to this and say, Christ is the fulfillment of Psalm 2. He is the anointed one. We might also point to something like Christ himself before the Sanhedrin, right? He's asked, "Tell us the truth. Are you the Christ, the anointed one, the Son of the Blessed One," right? Are you the Christ? Are you the anointed one? And Christ answers, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, what is that? That is a direct quote back out of Daniel 7, right? Daniel 7 tells us that the Son of Man will be led into the presence of the Almighty, that he'll be led into the presence of the Ancient of Days, and that he will be coming with the clouds of heaven. Christ answers a question, are you the anointed one, by saying, yes, I'm the guy in Daniel 7. Right? And they, of course, get this, right? You remember, they tear their clothes and say, we've heard the blasphemy. And so I think it's at least suggestive that if Christ answers a question about, are you the anointed one, by saying, yes, I'm the guy in Daniel 7, that Christ might also be indicating that he's the guy in Daniel 9 who's called the anointed one. You see what I'm saying there? If he's going to answer with language from Daniel about a question using language from Daniel, it seems like we have good initial reason to think this is the Messiah, this is Christ. Does that make sense?
So, I get back to this A and the thing. Most of the translations that I've looked at, LSB, Legacy Standard Bible, NASB,
The anointed one will
or
be
they
cut off.
say the holy place. They're even translate that the holy place, and I just can't help but think of Hebrews where it talks so much about Jesus Christ going into the holy of
Entering
holies.
into the true holy place, the place made without human hands,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, right, and anointing that place once and for all. And when you brought the verse where he said, I am he, and I am the Messiah, I just can't help but think that maybe the ESV just kind of, the interpreters kind of, put A1 in there and just maybe
There may be kind of some erring on the side
ambiguity
of trying to not over-assert from the passage, but then maybe missing some context of the rest of Scripture, right?
Yeah.
I don't know on that,
Yeah,
right?
I
Like,
just- yeah, I just-
that goes too far out of my field to
Yeah.
give a clean
Well, let's
answer
not
to
talk
it.
about these with the mass and divinity. So.
Well, one thing that, of all the unclarities, one thing that is clear is that no language in the ancient world makes that distinction as firmly as we want to in English between A and B. They just don't. So,
Yeah.
so it's not on their minds to make that distinction, and to read that distinction back in is to import the way we use language into the way they didn't use language.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Okay, so some reason then to think that the anointed one here is Christ. I want to put a caution on that and say not every appearance of anointed one is the Messiah. Okay, so let me look at one counterexample there. Here's from Isaiah chapter 45. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him that gates may not be closed. Well, who the heck is Cyrus? Cyrus is the king of Persia, who some 70-some years later is going to give the orders to send people back to Israel, to Jerusalem, to rebuild the city, right? And so this is a prophetic word. It is a striking prophetic word out of Isaiah that by name identifies the Persian king who will return the people to the land and calls him an anointed one, right? And so again, a Jewish reading of this passage says, that guy, the anointed one, the prince, that's Cyrus. Because obviously their interpretation is not, this is Jesus, right? Like, that's the reading here is, this is Cyrus is the guy who's going to return everyone. Does that make sense? At least that's a common reading. So anointed one doesn't have to be Christ, but I think Christ's own answer before the Sanhedrin gives us good reason to suspect that the anointed one here is Christ. And again, the timing sure works out pretty nicely if it is. Yeah? Is everybody okay there? Anybody else? Questions, comments? Anybody where we stand?
David is also called the anointed one.
Yeah.
Chronicles and other places.
Okay, good. Right. The king is the Lord's anointed. David even says of Saul, right? Should I raise my hand against the Lord's anointed, right? Saul is not, I think we can say with confidence. If there's one thing I can say confidently this morning, Saul is not the Messiah in the sense that we usually use the word, right? But he is an anointed one. Okay, good. Final question. Who are the people of the prince who is to come? Now the trick here is this. In order to say who the people of the prince are, you gotta first know who the prince is, right? And we've just established we don't agree on that first part. How are we gonna agree on the second part, right? Is that Christians, right? If the anointed one is Christ, is that us? Is that Rome? Is that a future empire of the Antichrist? Yes, to one of those, probably, right? But different answers depending on who we think the anointed one is. And then finally, a fourth question. We've got this half of the 70th week when sacrifice will be ended. When is that? When is the half of the 70th week? You remember that's, of course, 3.5 years. We've seen 3.5 years already in Daniel. We're about to see it again. We're going to see it again in Revelation. 3.5 darn years pop up all over the place here, right? Back in Daniel 7, the saints will be given into the hands of this enemy, this little horn, for a time, times, and half a time. Here in Daniel 9, for half the week, he, the prince who is to come, will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Does anything interesting happen for about 3.5 years? Yes! Too many interesting things happen for 3.5 years, because you'd think we could just look back and pick out the important thing that goes on for 3.5 years that might qualify and be like, that's it, that's the thing. Some things that last about 3.5 years. Christ's ministry on earth is about 3 years and change, right? It's about 3.5 years. Maybe that's Christ putting an end to sacrifice and offering by substituting himself. Dennis, going back to Hebrews here, right? Becoming the one true offering and replacing the sacrificial system. We talked about Antiochus Epiphanes, right? How he defiles the temple. Antiochus ends all sacrifices in the Jewish temple for 3 years and 10 days. That is about 3.5 or 3 and a part years, right? How about Nero? Nero declares war on Israel when they rise in revolt. Nero's part of the war, his oppression of the Jews, lasts from the middle or from the early parts of the year 66 to, late in the year 66 to early in the year 70. That is about 3.5 years. A lot of things happen for about 3.5 years. And so where we might hope that this would give us some clarity, it unfortunately does not uniquely identify an answer here, right? Any of these, depending on your perspective, might be in view. So these are the questions we must answer. Let's look at some concrete ways that the questions are answered. What are some systems we can put together that give a singular answer to what's going on here? We'll look first at a postmillennial view, then at a representative amillennial view, and finally at a premill or dispensationalist view. Okay, now I say this is a view. We're going to play with articles all over the place this morning. A view and not the view, right? This is a view of these three perspectives. You will find disagreement within them, but this would be a common view for each of these. I like these two, Dennis. Unfortunately, they didn't ask me. Okay, it was Scott. It's Scott's turn. There we go. Here's a postmillennial reading. We said, are the 70 weeks of years literal? Remember that was our first question? Postmillennial reading says mostly no. Maybe approximate times sometimes, but it is not meant to be read as 490 years on the nose. The prince who is to come is the same as the anointed one, which is to say it is the Messiah, it is Christ. Christ is the anointed one who's coming. He's the anointed one who's cut off. He's the prince who is to come. They all kind of fit together. Well, that kind of works, right? So we think that through. When is the anointed one cut off? Well, he's crucified, right? He is killed. He is slain among the people. That is the death of the anointed one, at which point he has nothing. Even his clothes are gambled away from him, right? Seems like it fulfills the prophecy. That is the abomination that causes desolation, or the desolation that's decreed. On the wings of abomination there will come that which makes desolate, right? What is that? That is the desolation of the crucifixion, right? It is the desolating of the temple. Why are sacrifices ended? They're ended because there is no more need for them, right? The veil of the temple is torn and the old sacrificial system is overturned. So he is cut off. His people then are the people he sends as his instrument, as his judgment on Jerusalem, the Romans who destroy the city in 70 AD. It's a post-millennial interpretation. It's all got to come back around to 70 AD sooner or later, right? The Romans are sent by Christ in judgment on Jerusalem for their sins. The city is destroyed, right? It is made desolate. And Christ confirms a covenant with many. That covenant is with us, right? We are the many with whom he strikes a covenant. It is the Christians of all nations, his followers of Jew and Gentile alike, called together to be joined in worship of him. That is the covenant for 1 week. The 1 week then is everything from that point pretty much onward, right? We are still in the covenant confirmed there. Is everybody good? Now look, if this was the only chapter in Daniel, I think this is the most plausible reading. If you had just Daniel 9 dropped into your lap and the rest of the book was gone, I think this reading makes the most sense, right? That the prince and the anointed one is just one guy the whole way through, bang, bang, bang. I think that plays together nicely. Half the week then is literal, it's the ministry of Christ, right? The half the week is Christ's ministry on earth. I think, and then, okay, so then we go back to our favorite passage, Matthew 24, right? The little apocalypse that Christ gives us, and Christ says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, right? This is him saying, look, when you see the crucifixion, when you see the veil in the holy place ripped apart, it's time to get out of Jerusalem because the end of Jerusalem will come not far after that. Be watchful, be ready for it. Here's kind of our timeline. Jerusalem's rebuilt in 535. Christ comes at the end of the 69 weeks. Again, it's not literal. Don't try to add that up to 493 and get it to work out, right? Christ comes for half the week. He ministers. And at the end of half the week, we have a second 3.5-year period of Nero's war, Nero's judgment that ends out the week, ending with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, right? Those are our timelines. That's our period breakdown there. The events, you can see how it kind of lines up, right? It kind of tracks. The trouble, I think, that the postmillennial view has is that this language of the abomination shows up in Daniel 8 and it shows up again in Daniel 11. And in both those places, the abomination that makes desolate is clearly something being done by the bad guys as part of their persecution of God's people, right? In Daniel 8, it is the little horn in Daniel 8 who rises up and puts an end to sacrifices and sets up the transgression. Christ is not the little horn, right? Pretty much nobody is going to read Daniel 8 and say, this is Christ's operation here. And yet, all these things of the ending of sacrifice, the setting up of abomination, that's something he's doing, not something Christ does by his ministry. You see what I'm saying? And so if there is any connection between the events in Daniel 8 and the events in Daniel 9, then the reading of Daniel 9 as all being things Christ is doing is hard to sustain. Same thing with chapter 11. This is, again, another bad guy sets up an abomination that makes desolate. Again, same words, very similar language. Seems very difficult to me to say all these are separate events, and just right in the middle of it, we've got a chapter that's about what Jesus is doing. Does that make sense? I think that is one of the biggest challenges the postmillennial view has, is in unifying Daniel chapter 9 with the chapters on either side of it. Now, we're going to point out problems that all these perspectives have. That's their big one, I think. Anybody a question on the post-mill? Nobody's got a question. All right. How about an amillennial reading? Now, look, some amillennials read this the way the post-mills do. Some amills read this the way the pre-mills do. But some of them say this is all just about Antiochus. Antiochus Epiphanes, he is the fulfillment of all of this, right? All this, right? There's been a lot in Daniel about Antiochus, a lot still to come about Antiochus. Daniel chapter 9 is about him too. So this reading says, who's the prince who is to come? It's Antiochus Epiphanes. Who are his people? They're his people, right? It's the Seleucid Empire. What do? They sacrifice a pig in the holy place. That's an abomination. It makes the holy place desolate. It puts an end to sacrifice and offering. The weeks here are entirely figurative. You cannot get the timelines to remotely match up. They're just entirely evocative. They have nothing to do with actual linear time. And so we in this view are in the 70th week, going from the life of Antiochus up through the present. Just all the rest of human history is Daniel's 70th week. At the end of the 70th week, it'll be the end of time. But up until then, everything is the 70th week. Does that make sense as a perspective? So here's kind of our timeline on that. Jerusalem gets rebuilt. Some years later, Antiochus goes to war with Jerusalem, right? So again, this is somewhere in the mid-160s or so BC. You cannot make these timelines match up for 490. You can't even get them close. Somewhere in there, they go to war. The temple is defiled. The sacrifices end. Antiochus confirms a covenant with many. He goes to renegade Jews and he says, come join over onto my side. Come team up with me and I will put you in charge, right? I'll put my own high priest in place. You send all the money my way. We'll all get along great, right? He confirms a covenant with many. He ends sacrifices for 3.5 years. That's true. Then he is overthrown by the Maccabees. He dies. And then the rest of the week is just the rest of human history. Now look, is Antiochus in view in a lot of the book of Daniel? I think without question. Right? There are parts, especially in chapter 11, that you read and go, yep, that is just about a biography of the man laid out here. I think there's no question on that. On the other hand, again, Christ in Matthew 24 is going to look and he's going to say, when you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel. Now question, does Christ live before or after Antiochus Epiphanes? After, right? He is saying this almost 200 years later, and he is still talking about watch out for the abomination. Now, if the only fulfillment of the abomination is when Antiochus sacrifices a pig, what the heck is happening over here, right? And so I think while we can say, yes, Antiochus is a fulfillment of some of what's being prophesied here, he doesn't seem like he can be the end of the story. That seems like a big challenge for this amillennial perspective. How do you deal with the fact that it still seems to be ongoing? Questions on the Amil reading? Yes?
Is there a defense for changing the unit of the week so aggressively, where you go from this is approximately a year, and now we come to the end, and that's just the 3.5 weeks, or the half a week is now...
Is now actually 3.5 years, or have its thousands and thousands?
Yeah.
I mean, the defense is, so just to be transparent, the amillennial reading, and to a lesser extent the postmillennial reading of Daniel, are one of the parts that frustrate me most about those perspectives. There's parts that frustrate me on the premill and the dispensationalist too. This is a place where they frustrate me. Because I have tried to read commentaries on Daniel from some of these authors, and there's a point where they just say, well, Daniel is apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature, you shouldn't look for any kind of literal fulfillment on the timing. And so if there is one, that's great, but you shouldn't expect anything there. And that's just the style of the literature says, you shouldn't expect literal times and dates. It's all just meant to evoke completion and completeness and satisfaction. And I find that very difficult to address. Yes, but we literally 2 verses before had Jeremiah being literally fulfilled, right? I find that very hard to fit together.
Do they say that Jeremiah is also apocryphal? Not apocryphal.
Apocalyptic. That's a great question. Do they say that Jeremiah is apocalyptic? I have not read commentary that says that. A lot of the times what I have seen is that apocalyptic literature is a genre. They point to Daniel as one of the big roots of that. There are, in the intertestamental period, there are a lot of books that are written in apocalyptic style, right? And then they will say, well, Revelation is also in the apocalyptic style. Also, we should not look for any kind of literal fulfillment here because that's how you write apocalyptic literature, going back to Daniel. And then I tear my hair out a little bit, right? And that's the point where I say, yes, but you asserted that about... You see what I'm saying, right? I find that to be one of the points of difficulty, is why not follow through the idea of literality here? And I'm not going to say there's not one. I have not found a commentary that I was really satisfied by the arguments they made as to dividing that out. About the strongest argument I've seen is just they say, look, the starting point and the ending point here don't quite line up, and so we have to conclude this is non-literal fulfillment. How you get the unit changes there, that's a great question, and I've not read anything really good on that one way or the other. Yeah, you're welcome. Anyone else? Alan?
How do they explain in verse 26, if they say this is Antiochus, that it says the city and the sanctuary are destroyed? Obviously, he didn't do that.
Okay, good. There is war in Jerusalem, and so the argument is that there is sufficient death and destruction in Jerusalem that it counts as the city being destroyed. I found some debates on this, some commentators arguing back and forth, and that was basically what they said is, look, there's lots of upheaval, there's lots of destruction in Jerusalem. Yes, it's not an ending of the city, but AD 70 doesn't end the city either, and we still count that as Jerusalem being destroyed a lot of times, right? That's called, or people refer to it as the destruction of Jerusalem. We don't mean that nobody can ever live there ever again, just the city is savaged, right? The city is wrecked. That's the argument that I saw, is just to say there is mass destruction in this time, and maybe it's enough. All good? Okay, third perspective. The premillennial reading says the prince who is to come is not the same guy as the anointed one. The anointed one is Christ. Christ is cut off after pretty close to literally 483 years. The prince who is to come is a separate guy. That is linguistically awkward. So let's get one of the weaknesses here right up front. That is linguistically awkward to make that division. But if you make that split, then the rest kind of follows. The prince who is to come is a prince who is still to come. He is the final enemy, the final little horn, right? He is the Antichrist. Who are his people? They are the people of the Antichrist, right? His empire, remember back in Revelation, the white horseman that we saw is plausibly a conqueror, an Antichrist figure. They're his empire riding out in conquest. He confirms a covenant with many, his followers who worship the beast and the idol that he sets up, right? We'll read about that as we go forward in Revelation. His people then are the covenant that is set up. He ends sacrifice and offering, right? Daniel seems to present ending sacrifice and offering as a bad thing. Surely any Jew in Daniel's day sees it that way. This reading sees it that way as well. This is a bad thing. He ends sacrifice and offering. This is the key move of the premillennial or dispensationalist view. At the end of the 69th week, the clock stops. So we get 69 weeks in, Christ is cut off and dies, and there is a pause at the resurrection. And the pause persists until some future date, at which point it restarts and you run out the last 7 years, the period that often is called the tribulation, right? And so the premill reading says Revelation is the discussion of this last 7 years of Daniel. It is the working out of what that will be. But we are right now in a pause between weeks 69 and 70. And so we still await that fulfillment. If we diagram that, it looks something like this. Jerusalem gets fully rebuilt about 445 BC. Christ dies about 30 AD. While there is some fuzziness in the time periods, that is about 483 years, depending how you count it. Again, some have argued, there's a particular scholar who argues that from the date of a decree to the triumphal entry is exactly 483 years to the day. The trick is you have to count years in a particular way, and very few scholars believe that the triumphal entry happened in 32 AD. But if both those things are right, you can get it day on perfect, right? Even if those things are not, you get pretty darn close. Yeah? Pretty strikingly close to 483 years. Christ dies and rises again. The anointed one is cut off, right? After this, the passage says the city and sanctuary will be destroyed. So somewhere subsequent here we have this destruction. There's this long pause that we are still in today, and we still wait the final 1 week fulfillment here. Somewhere in the midst of that, there is the abomination set up. We still wait for that, right? And we have an end to sacrifices as half of that final week. That ends, the world ends, sin is brought to an end, prophecy and judgment are sealed up. All the rest of that passage is then fulfilled there. We all good? Okay. Some problems. This is, again, an odd way to read the prince. Right? You got to split that third prince off from the earlier guy. That's kind of awkward. There is nothing in the passage that indicates that the clock pauses at 69 weeks. There's nothing there. It does not say that happens. It does not imply that happens. You have to just assert that this is a revealed truth, that there is a gap here. And then there's a weirdness in us today reading this and going, oh no, he's going to put a stop to sacrifices and offerings. Because God doesn't want sacrifices and offerings, right? That was shadow. That's done. I mean, let's start with, you can't do sacrifices and offerings because there's no temple, right? But even if there is one, the whole of the book of Hebrews is the author of that book imploring his Jewish brethren and saying, don't go back to the temple. The temple's done. We have a better temple. We have a better priest. We have better sacrifices. God doesn't want those. They never fulfilled their purpose. They were only there to point to Christ. That is the only thing they ever did. And so, how then do we make sense of he will put an end to sacrifices as a bad future thing? That's difficult. And yet it's hard to see any other reading of Daniel that takes all the prophecies of abominations and desolations and unifies those into one event. If you're going to make that a singular thing described by this same language in 3 or 4 different places, it is hard to see a different way to fuse all those together into one thing, while still making it future from Matthew 24. Yeah? Does that make sense? Those are the challenges in each of these perspectives, at least as I see them. But those are 3 major ways of reading Daniel. There's variants, right? I'm not being exhaustive here, but those are 3 major ways of seeing Daniel 9. Daniel 9. Alan?
Doesn't the pre-mill reading then say that Jerusalem has to be destroyed sometime now, the beginning of the tribulation or the rest?
Okay, good. So either Jerusalem is destroyed as part of AD 70, and they'll say that's the destruction of Jerusalem, that counts for that part of the prophecy. Or they will say that is part of the last 7 years. We will see when we get back to Revelation 11 that there is some discussion of a trampling of the city underfoot that takes place in that passage. Some would say that is the fulfillment of the destruction of Jerusalem in this. Good.
How true is it there are many commentators I've read that says that interpreting Daniel 9 is the key to really interpreting?
It has extreme implications for how you read everything else in Daniel and in Revelation, right? If you read Daniel 9 and say, I'm missing a week, I need this last week, where is it? That puts pretty strong implications on what you do with Revelation, right? If you read Daniel and you say, cool, all that happened and is done, then everything in Revelation that looks like Daniel references has to be symbolic in its fulfillment, and it's just calling out the ideas, evoking the message of Daniel to give a spiritual implication, but without a literal future fulfillment, at least not literal and future to us. Yeah. And that's exactly why we paused and went back here, is to say this is going to shape the way we make sense of the back half of Revelation. In a pretty major way, this is going to shape that. Okay, I swear I can do Daniel 11 in like 3 minutes. You ready? Daniel 11 is great, and you should read it, because Daniel 11 and 12 is just a long chain of events that literally happened during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. It's like, and then this king will rise up, and he'll have kids, and one of them will be like that, and then there will be a big sea battle, and you can go through that, and you can match them up to specific individuals and specific events that go bump, ba-bump, 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 all the way down. I'm not going to read these in the interest of time. I'm just going to say each of these events kind of plays out in history. Right up until the end. And right at the end of 11 into 12, it starts getting harder to read. This king shall do as he wills. He'll exalt and magnify himself against every god and speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He'll pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or the one beloved by women. He will not pay attention to any other god, for he'll magnify himself above all. Well, that doesn't quite work for Antiochus. Antiochus does ignore the gods of his fathers. He prefers other new gods to the gods that his lineage have traditionally worshipped. That part fits. But he still has other gods he's worshiping. He doesn't set aside all gods the way this passage suggests that he will. You see it? Likewise, we have no idea who the one beloved by women is. Answers range everywhere from the heathen god Tammuz to Christ to just saying that he doesn't like women. We don't know what that fulfillment is or how it matches up nicely with Antiochus. And then you turn the page over to chapter 12. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as there never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Now that could be about the Maccabean revolt. Whew, it's just the Maccabean revolt. We're good. Verse 2 surely will not challenge my interpretation of this. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake to everlasting life and to everlasting contempt. Oh no. That doesn't happen in the Maccabean revolt. It is not recorded that a bunch of dead people came back to life, right? That sounds like final judgment things. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up these words and seal the book until the time of the end. Until the time of the end, we are told, right? Some part of this no longer matches history. Some part of this seems to point forward to some yet future events. And indeed, in Matthew 24, this is the clearest referent for Christ saying, watch for these things to happen. Is this spiritualized? Spiritually, many who sleep in the dust of the earth will rise up. Is this the fall of Jerusalem? Is this a prophecy yet awaiting fulfillment? If there is a word of comfort here, a word perhaps of some further understanding that we might hope for, it is those verses at the end. You, Daniel, seal up this prophecy, for it concerns the time of the end. Because, pass forward just a moment here. Because this is a line we will find echoed at the very end of Revelation. And he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. Next week, we return to our unsealed prophecy we will be back in the book of Revelation, and we will see how some of Daniel's words connect forward there. I will see you then. Have a great rest of your week.